Okay, today I have the pleasure of talking to one of my favorite people in the whole world. His name's Terry Pender. He works at Columbia, but he also does about a bazillion other things. He's a super active musician. He's super active in the area of academics and recently in writing. He's about to kick off a course with Cadenza that is going to be about the history of recording and recorded music. So I'm really excited about that. I am definitely taking it. It sounds incredible. So with that, I want to introduce you to Terry Pender. Hey, Terry, how are you today?
Great. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. Thank you so much for coming to hang out on the podcast.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
So let's start off by talking about all the things that you're currently doing, because my knowledge of you is that you actually have done or are doing about 400 things at any given time. So, So why don't we talk about what you're working on right now?
Okay. I'm one of the great behind-the-scenes people, I think, in electronic music and in interactive music. There's just so much to do. So I'm the associate director at the Computer Music Center at Columbia University, where I also work with our Sound Arts program, which we just started 3 years ago. So I have a lot of teaching responsibilities and working directly with those students. Also at Columbia University, I help run this Alice M. Ditson Fund, which is a philanthropic organization which gives money for new music performances and presentations. And I also work at Columbia, where I run the Pulitzer Prize in Music meetings each year here. So this last year, Henry Threadgill won the Pulitzer Prize. So that's kind of my academic work, which is a pretty full plate. On top of that, I do try to play professionally. I'm a mandolin player, guitar player, and harmonica mainly. And I've had a long-standing trio. I think we're just celebrating our 10th year now, called PGT. And that's me, Terry Pender, and then Greg Taylor and Brad Garton. Brad Garton is the director of the center here at Columbia University, and Brad and I have worked together. I've been at Columbia for 20 years, and we had worked at the Cincinnati Conservatory of Music for about 3 years before that. So Brad and I have worked together as a team basically for 23 years. Gregory Taylor is another good friend of ours that we've met at the International Computer Music Conferences in the old days. And Gregory Taylor also works for Cycling 74. We're big users of Cycling 74 software. I teach here at Columbia Interactive Sound and Video, which is basically a max class. And so the three of us got together about 10 years ago to explore the idea of trying to have an interactive band. Several years ago, one of my former students, Luc Dubois, and I were at a conference. And this is at the beginning of interactivity, and we were watching people perform, quote unquote, interactive pieces, and they all seemed kind of canned to me. Or they're doing interactivity based on percentages or, weighted randomness or whatnot. But it wasn't truly interactive in the sense that, say, a normal improvisation is interactive. So I came up with this idea that I wanted to be a performer and have my sound completely controlled by the other members of the group, so that I would be able to play, I'd be able to do whatever I wanted to, but they would have control over that. And we did our first version of this. We called it the Terry Pender Orchestra, and it was, again, with Brad Garton. Luc Dubois was one of the processors at the time. He was a student. Another student, Doug Gears, who is now the dean of Brooklyn College Computer Music Center, I think. Mm-hmm. He was the third person. So we did this at the Kitchen in New York City, where I went out with electric guitar. I sent my signal to all three of them. They had three different means of processing my signal, and they could decide whether to turn me up, turn me down, turn the processing up. And so I walked out to improvise, basically, and then they had complete control of my sound, and then I had to deal with that. So I was very interested in kind of really pushing this interactive idea where you are actually giving up control at some level. And I've always been an improviser, and I think, improvising in electronic music, the more I can hand off that interactivity to other people, I can concentrate solely then on my performance.
Sure.
To be really in the moment, and then also to react against whatever's going to be thrown at me, or the fact that I could be on stage. And this happened to me one night with Luc Dubois, where I was up on stage and I'm playing and just absolutely nothing is coming out. And he had set up a process where he had a buchla sequence running, and my notes would only go through if I happened to play one of the notes of the buchla played, and it opened up a gate for me.
Okay.
So part of the performance was me on stage in front of an audience figuring out how that system worked in order to get sound out. So it's even to that extreme where it's like, nothing's going to happen. And they didn't tell me that ahead of time, so I had to figure it out. I started playing really fast. Nothing's coming out. Oh, every fourth note's coming out. Oh. So it's kind of a fun thing. So it's a bit of a game in a sense, but also I think then you're really improvising and it's truly interactive.
Right.
So the other idea is just that idea of ambient music, which Gregory Taylor and Brad Garton and I love. I had done some time playing with Robert Fripp in the League of Crafty Guitarists. Brad and Gregory are extremely influenced by Brian Eno. So we decided also to put those ideas of the ambient music that Fripp and Eno had created, but to do it live. So again, we needed a live instrumentalist, and we needed our processors instead of the two Revox tape recorders. Mm-hmm. And we kind of just started doing this ourselves so that we could create a body of music that was live ambient music that then I would go back and mix and produce more or less. Sure.
Very interesting. You guys have traveled all over the place doing that work too, haven't you?
We played extensively in Portugal for about 3 years. We went back each year. We were playing in several rural areas and both teaching classes and giving workshops and then giving concerts. And so that was really interesting. The man who was booking us for these concerts, when he saw that we were interested in this improvisation idea as well, he actually set up our third tour over there to Portugal. He set up a series of dates where we would play the first half of the show, and then the second half we'd have an intermission, and then when the second half of the show opened, I would walk out from one end of the stage, and somebody I had never met before would walk out from the other end of the stage, a famous Portuguese musician. Okay. And then we would start playing and performing and improvise on stage together with Brad and Gregory doing the processing. Mm-hmm. So that was really exciting too, because we played with these fabulous Portuguese guitarists and traditional instruments, and they were all game for it, and it was just, it created a type of music that I just don't think we would ever have imagined creating on our own.
All right. Now, in addition to all of that, you have recently been working on sort of like collecting the stories and the information around the history of recorded music. We've been talking over the years, and you're actually working on a book project in that regards, right?
Yeah, I would say my main area of research is the history of recording production techniques.
Okay.
So like many of us, I'm obsessed with echo, I'm obsessed with reverb, I'm obsessed with doubling and these interesting basic recording studios techniques we can do. Mm-hmm. But I was also very interested about when did these things start occurring, and who were the originators of some of these techniques? Why do we have compression? Who invented compression? Where did it come from? With this idea that I have a better sense of the history of what the need was to create these devices or these techniques, understand who the original innovators were and how they used the techniques, and then see how they can be, updated so we could do them on our laptops or whatnot, and how we can use them in a innovative way today. It's like, just to say a simple example, Logic has all these great compressors in it. Mm-hmm. They're clearly different, but they really don't tell you that much about it. So I spent a lot of time researching all those compressors to find out what they're modeled on. You go back to those models, here are the settings on those models, and I think if you start using the proper settings, you can get a lot further. Then, of course, do whatever you want, but if you understand what they're trying to model in each case, I think you can use it more effectively.
Yeah, well, that's actually kind of an interesting point, because so oftentimes these things are kind of thrown down without any contextualization. And so unless you're either willing to just hit the presets or do that kind of background research, you may never be able to actually get the best out of any of these processors.
Yeah, and it's a great thing and a terrible thing at the same time with I think with any software, but Logic has all these great sounds in it, but they have so many effects already put in place that, if you ever bring up a sample or you bring up one of their instruments, you really have to go in and strip everything off again, because they sound great when they're solo, but they don't sound good in the context of a mix, because they have too much reverb, and the reverb's not EQ'd, and it's not pre-delayed, and everything else. So the sounds sound luscious and really inviting by themselves, but they don't blend that well once you get to the mixing stage. So I think, just the basic things like going back with reverb, just all the amazing ways that you can use reverb, but then to also make sure that they know to EQ it, to pre-delay it, how you want to use reverb differently on voice than on an instrument, how to balance the natural reverb of a room with the artificial reverb you can put in, and then even with a convolution reverb, doing fun things like using strange impulse responses that are not really room sounds but can create interesting convolution ideas with your reverbs.
Right. Now, I think it's interesting that you're pointing out Logic, because Logic and, I think of Ableton Live as doing this too. They have sort of this meta effects where you select something and all of a sudden you've inadvertently dropped 10 effects on your track. And you're right, it makes that one track sound phenomenal, but it also sounds really out of place when you put it in mix. To what extent are you concerned with the techniques of mixing, or are you mostly really focusing on the effects processors and how they came, what their historical route has been?
It's really both. I mean, my ultimate goal is really a good mix always. Mm-hmm. And so that's the students, by the time they get to me, they should already know how to use Logic. And so then now I'm really trying to help them refine a mix. And part and parcel with that is to really go through all the different effects devices and give them a good sense of how they've been used traditionally, and then ideas of how we could use them any way we want. But again, just understanding when they're used, how they're used, listening to all the interesting ways that they were used, and being able to, part of it, I think, for me is listening to a mix and being able to identify what you hear. So in a sense, it's partially a digital orchestration course as well, so that when I hear a piece, I say, oh, that's a pumping compressor there, that sound. Is that a chorus or a flange? Oh, yes, that's a flange. And over here, so I want to make sure when students listen to that music, they know exactly what they hear. And especially with a lot of the newer EDM and hip hop music, I have students all the time bringing in a song saying, what's happening right here? What do you think that sound is? And so we go through that kind of deconstruction process to figure out, oh, here's what I think they're doing.
Right.
And a lot of it you can do just being knowledgeable about the techniques, that are somewhat independent of the genres. So,
mm-hmm. So I'm gonna want to dig into that further, because what you've kind of are talking about there is almost like sound design CSI or something. Right?
You're right.
Which is really great. And I want to talk a little more about that. But before we get there, in addition to all this stuff, you have this history as sort of like a very accomplished mandolin player and guitarist that's worked with a lot of amazing people. You somehow came through the system and really came to understand computer music and electronics. And I am curious about your background and where you come from, because frankly, the more I learn about you, the more I think that you actually are much like Sun Ra, and that you just dropped in from Saturn, and with centuries of information already inside of your skull, right? I need to understand where you come from and how it is that you can be so accomplished in so many things and have had so many great experiences.
Who knows? It's a little hard to talk about, but let's try to figure it out. I think part of it is I've moved around a lot in my life. When I was a child, we never lived anywhere for more than 3 or 4 years at a time. So I moved around a lot. I've lived in interesting places. I was born in Chicago, in the city. My family is Irish. I was exposed to a lot of Irish music early on. Then I lived in northern New Jersey during late middle school, the beginning of high school, during the whole kind of rock revolution thing. And then I moved to Cincinnati in the middle of high school, where all that stuff didn't seem to exist, and I got very involved in bluegrass and whatnot. But I've played all my life, more or less, starting with guitar, and I was initially drawn to acoustic blues guitar. Mm-hmm. And I spent a lot of time playing guitar and harmonica, Sonny Terry, Brownie McGee, Reverend Gary Davis, and doing, of course, all the electric stuff. I got very much into electric blues. I started playing in bands probably when I was about 16 years old. I started playing in bars in Cincinnati as a rock and roll guitar player. I was very interested in effects. I didn't have a lot of money, and so I tried to really use the effects as innovatively as I could. I didn't have the ability to buy a lot of Also at the time, I would say I was very naive in a sense. So things like backwards guitar sounds on a Beatles record or something like that, I didn't really understand how they did that. And I didn't really try to think about it that much. So if I wanted to play one of those guitar solos, I just tried to learn it on a regular guitar with a regular echo, or
Right.
So we just tried to start doing everything we possibly could. And I don't know how it happened, but I got into improvising, really even avant-garde improvising, when I was in high school. Part of that was this idea of Robert Fripp and King Crimson and Brian Eno. I was very much into that as soon as it started, and with tape recorders and electric guitar and stuff, it seems like, you could easily do that. I was a kid with my cassette recorder recording everything. And so one of the things is I really spent a lot of time learning different kinds of music. I spent a lot of time trying to become a really proficient blues player. I spent a lot of time trying to become a really proficient rock and roll player. And I spent a good 10 or 15 years on each of those things. And now I kind of bounce back between them all. I think the other thing from moving around a lot is I'm a little quiet on one level, but I'm just soaking in everything from every source and resource that I can. So the nice thing about meeting Brad Garton is we did travel all over the world, and I got to meet most of the great computer musicians and a lot of the great musicians through him. And I would be that kind of person who would be sitting in the corner of the room, kind of quiet and aloof maybe, but I was really listening and soaking everything in, and all the ideas that they were discussing, just trying to internalize them and decide, oh, how could I make use of that? Or, oh, that's an interesting idea, and if I change these three things, then that would really maybe be more interesting and can make it work. So we were taking a lot of these kind of theoretical conversations and ideas, and then I would come back and try to stick it into a piece or into an improvisation and get it to work with PGT or on my own.
Sure.
I guess part and parcel that goes along with that is then I have done quite a bit of sound design work for art films for a group called the Open Ended Group, which today I think is Paul Kaiser and Mark Downey. They've gone through some changes. But I did most of the sound design for them for a good 10-year period, and we have a really solid 7 or 8 pieces that have been touring the world, for the past 15 years.
Sure.
And they are they do motion capture animations. We've done them with Bill T. Jones, the choreographer. They did some with Merce Cunningham. And they're these beautiful art animations based on motion capture, and they were very severe about how they wanted sound used. They would each send me back 3 pages of notes. At second 22, I like this, don't like that, do more of this, do more of that. And at first it was scary because I thought, wow, they don't like anything I'm doing. But what I learned was they knew exactly what they wanted. And what they were really good at was, number one, not saying, hey, that's good, that's bad, but this is good. We like that because of this. Do more of that.
It's interesting to get that kind of feedback, and also to be around people that are that disciplined, because in a way, it's sort of like the current world doesn't lend itself towards being accepting of discipline, right? It's almost like, man, everybody should get to do what they want to do, which is very liberating, but at the same time, sometimes doesn't push you into exceeding your own personal expectations.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct and true. And in a lot of ways, I think that's why it was a pretty formidable experience of me working with them. Because when they liked something, they loved it, and they would be your champion till the end of the world.
Right.
If they didn't like something, me, I would go back and I would try to slip it into the second mix.
Right.
And I'd get that note again the second time. No. I would try to change it in a way that I thought they would then like it. I would do that a second time, and I maybe even would do it a third time occasionally until I finally said, okay, I get it. You completely don't like what I'm doing there, and I'm going to start again.
Right.
But that really did help kind of sink into what are we trying to accomplish, and what message am I trying to send with the sound in conjunction to the movement, and how am I trying to ground this animated figure in space so that it actually seems realistic and believable. And once you get into kind of this different way of looking at it, it does make a lot of sense, and I think you can really structure this is going to sound really corny, but just a higher level artwork when you have a team of people really looking at it that critically and working together. And so since a lot of what I do today with my music is improvised and with PGT and is pretty loose, having that other side helps me keep on balance. And in a sense, I bring a lot of that discipline to PGT than when I'm playing and mixing. Because
Right.
I know that as we perform, I'm just that type of person that as we start going, I get a trajectory in my mind. And again, it's a very interactive group. So my signal and my sound can disappear, can come back. What I played 5 minutes ago can come back to me in a different key and backwards and upside down. So I have to kind of know where I've been, but I can really kind of traverse that area much better because I then bring that discipline from the sound design and video work to what I'm doing with PGT. And I'm listening really carefully and trying to really then take the process. How can I turn this now not only into a performance, but then into a composition? And then since I go back afterwards and I'm the person who does the actual mixing, I can really push that a lot further. You know, we just did a session about 2 weeks ago, a recording session, and Brad was questioning a lot of the processing that I had on this track that I did with the ukulele. He goes, it's not there at first, and it gradually comes in. It's like, no, I really wanted it to come from the mandolin, from the ukulele, so I want the ukulele to start. Once I explained it, he understood it completely, but I think he was also a little surprised that I had this whole kind of game plan in mind as well. But that helps, you know, it keeps our improvisation somewhat compositionally structured. And I think that's what makes PGT maybe a little bit more interesting than your average improvisers or something.
So I'm always curious with somebody who has both a playing and a recording, you know, a desire for both playing and recording, which is the thing that gets you off most? Do you play so that you can record, or do you record so that you can play and spread the word about your playing? You know, it's sort of like a lot, you know, for me, I like playing, but it's recording and sound design and those kind of things that I really love, right? Mm-hmm. And a lot of times playing is sort of like an avenue to almost like excite that procedure.
Yeah.
Where do you come from? Where do you sit on that continuum?
I'm really in the middle because I still am going out and playing in a more traditional manner, I guess. So right now, the thing I've been doing for the last year and a half or so is I've become very interested in the kind of the Django Reinhardt gypsy jazz guitar thing. Mm-hmm. So I have been going every weekend up to SUNY New Paltz and playing with these gypsy jazz guys. You know, no computers, no nothing. It's, you know, we're not even recording. So it's just for the fun of playing and performing and improvising, and I love to do that. But with the PGT stuff and that, it's really, to me, it's more about the recording and the mixing. I love to mix. I love to do sound design. You know, and I guess that's maybe why the performances are interesting, because I'm trying to think of all these little things that we can put in there that will then be fun to mix. Right. we'll make good compositions.
Yeah, it's actually interesting because what you talk about when you talk about sort of like doing almost real-time sound design or whatever, mm-hmm. one of the things that I've always conjectured is that if you look at a lot of the great producers, and like Lanois is a person I think of immediately, mm-hmm. But there's a lot of examples of this. There's a preponderance of people who are very accomplished producers that are bass players, right? Yeah. And I've always thought it's because the role of a bass player in a band is one that's almost like real-time production, right? Mm-hmm. A bass player can either follow along and not pay attention, or actually really drive the sound of a band just through very subtle means, right? And I always thought that set a person up to be a very strong producer. It sounds like that's kind of, you kind of take that same approach when you're working with the PGT thing, which is that through sort of like subtle movements, you actually kind of draw people into different directions, or are able to kind of push them in different directions.
Yeah. And I mean, again, you have to have the personnel to do that, and I'm very fortunate that both Gregory Taylor and Brad Gartner, they're ready to go. Basically, mm-hmm. They're like, sure, throw something at us, let's get going, and see what you can do, Pender. And so I like that, and I think they enjoy it as well. So it is challenging. I mean, one of the things we talked about, Gregory was just out here about 2 weeks ago, and we had figured out that we've been doing this for about 10 years, but the recordings that we did we all thought were significantly different. Mm-hmm. And so there is, we've got this body of material now that we can really go back and look at. And there truly is growth, and things are changing and evolving still. So that's kind of that's just a happy thing to recognize and to see. So I was just thinking the other end about the discipline angle is kind of before I went back into academia, I did spend time doing music for television. So for a while, I was doing music for the soap operas, for The Guiding Light, The Search for Tomorrow, and all my children. Yes, they've all since gone off the air. I don't think it was because of my music, but it's possible. But that was the same type of thing where we would go into a studio with a friend of mine late at night after they're closed, and we would try to produce 1 minute of sound design that we could then send to the music producer at the television station here in New York, and then they would pull that depending on what they did. And I never listened. I didn't even have a TV at the time, so we were writing this music. But again, it was this disciplined thing where you're looking at 5 seconds of music and 10 seconds of music, and seeing what the trajectory of that is as compared to the minute, as compared to the show or something. So it is a different way of looking at the function of music and how it functions in different emotions and in different, I don't know.
Was that doing like stingers or little sound effecty things, or like the wah, 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 when something strange is happening? Is it that kind of thing, or?
No, I was doing the background beds of the sound.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So I thought they were called soap cues. Okay. And so in some way it's the most anonymous music in the world in a sense, but I loved it because you could be more avant-garde in what you're creating, because you're creating music and labeling it per emotion for them to use, because, he lost his memory, the spaceman came down, or all the crazy things that happened. Right. So I could really go to a lot of different places with it.
Yeah, well, that sounds fun, because it's like, to go into a studio and say, well, we're going to compose a piece for coming out of the shower with a knife now. That really is a pretty open canvas to paint upon.
But on the other hand, you have to be really careful, because you can do all sorts of interesting things harmonically, texturally, but not rhythmically, not melodically necessarily, because the text, the speech, it's a background, so that has to be up front. So again, it was this interesting early look at ambient music, say, from a production aesthetic, not from, say, the musician aesthetic.
Right. Recently, I did an interview with Micah Frank, and he talked about how, like, the biggest selling thing in sample world is tools and loops and stuff that sort of provide ambience. And it's really interesting that people in that world talk about ambient music. They use the same phrase, but it means a completely different thing, because it's sort of like these things that bolster your awareness of an emotion, or bolsters your awareness of a mental state. Mm-hmm. So I want to go back to something you talked about earlier, which is this idea of digital orchestration and working with your students in sort of figuring out the techniques that they hear, and doing that kind of like CSI, that investigative work on existing recordings. First of all, and maybe the most obvious question, is what is the thing that people ask you about the most?
Usually it's, with my undergraduates, there's some kind of odd compression and filtering combination to create some unusual texture out of a vocal sample. Mm-hmm. All these little weird things where they can't quite figure, what's happening here and how's that going on. And of course, you can do so much with filtering, but the way they do they kind of combine it with this weird compression and pumping. It's, right. It can be hard to grab sometimes. I guess part of what I'm doing to help that, and this goes back to the book or what I'm doing for Cadence, is I'm trying to create a canon, and this sounds terribly boring and academic, but I'm trying to create a canon of production techniques, mm-hmm. so that when we talk about doubling, you can say, here are 15, 20 examples of different types of doubling. When we talk about phase shifting or flanging or echoing, or we talk about a plate reverb versus a spring reverb versus an echo chamber versus a convolution reverb, can we start to hear those things? So to grab all the music and say, all of this music was done using EMT plate reverbs. Mm-hmm. All of this, this music was all done using, a Fender Twin spring reverb or something.
Right.
Here's where you can really hear vocal saturation on a James Brown recording or something. Right at this moment, right here. That's what it sounds like. So number one, recognizing and building up a canon so people have a reference of, that first flanging or the first doubling, the first echo, and how those were, and sometimes why they were used. Some of the early doubling stories have to do with musician strikes and, odd things like that don't really have anything to do with the music.
Right.
But during a lot of the musician strikes, vocalists and harmonica players were often not considered musicians in the union. So you could do all these a cappella dates, or you could do these crazy blues harmonica dates when you couldn't do other recordings.
Interesting.
And the vocalists, if you couldn't hire other people, with Bill Putnam and Patti Page, he couldn't hire a background vocalist, so he just did it with her.
Right.
So sometimes it's just necessity is the mother of invention. But again, I think going back to those kind of critical moments, my ultimate goal is for that idea for the students to develop a personal sound. Because to me, the most important thing, and this is an old story that really goes back to Les Paul. Les Paul's mother called him up one day and said, "Oh, I heard you on the radio. You're playing in Chicago last night, huh?" He's like, "No, I played in New York last night." She said, No, I heard you in Chicago. It was you on guitar." He's like, "No, it wasn't me." Turned out to be George Barnes, and his mother was like, "He's playing just like you. He's stealing your stuff." And Les Paul went back and thought, wow, my mother doesn't even know if it's me playing on the radio or not. I have sound immediately identifiable. So whenever I come on the radio, my mother can say, "Oh, yes, that's my boy Les playing." And I say that to my students. If your music came on the radio, would your parents, would your significant other be able to identify it as your music, a new piece, like that's your sound?
Right.
We can do it with lots of people, with Miles Davis, with Pat Metheny, with millions of people. They have this idea of a signature sound, and they've created the sound, and it's recognizable, and hopefully it's new and different. So this idea then is I'm really trying to get them to look towards a personal sound, an overall personality that they can start to get that's unique and is their own, and to study people who have developed their own sound and get that idea of how we can do that. And part of that, I think, is recognizing where you are in the history of music. I have this theory of music that things always start, somebody comes up with a good idea. It's a simple idea, so lots of people can do it. And lots of people start to do it, and it becomes popular. As more people develop this idea, it becomes more complex. Oh, let's do this to the idea. Let's add a string section. Let's add drums. Let's add samples. Let's whatever. And the music becomes more and more and more complex until we finally get to a point where the music is so complex, very few people can actually now perform that music anymore. And there's usually some kind of bifurcation where it breaks down.
Right.
And the complicated people go, but another group falls off because we're going back to basics. So it could be the punk rock movement, the Seattle stuff. We're always going back to basics. We're reacting against progressive rock or something else. In classical music, you could look at minimalism as that. In jazz, you could look at, cool jazz,
right.
All that stuff, going back more to melody, more to beat, while other people still went on and pursued the more complicated avenue. So then what I'm trying to get my students to understand, to try to decide for themselves, and I don't want to tell them this, is where are you in that continuum? Right. Are you pushing your music forward? Are you adding more things to it, making it more diverse, or are you want to react against that and make your music simpler, purify it somehow? And so these production techniques we have to look at, because if you want to pull back, you've got to jettison these things.
Yeah.
And if you want to go forward, you need to learn how to use them in more innovative ways, or in ways that people haven't before. I have this whole weird idea of the history and where we are in the history and whether we're fighting the tide or going with the tide. And if the students have all that information, my hope is that then they will be able to really create a musical personality that they can put out and be successful with.
Yeah, that's actually a great way to put it, too, because, in fact, you're not actually preferencing one direction over the other. If people want to push forward, you're going to help them figure out ways to do that. If they're going to revert to purity, there's ways to do that too. I think that's actually a really neat way to present it, because otherwise, it prevents you from running down the prog rock poo hole, right?
Yeah.
Where now it's like it gets to the point where you can't even make an impression on people unless you speed up your recordings and then find some way to cope with it live, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a really interesting way to provide that information. So that kind of started off in a discussion about what do people often ask for. What I'm curious is there anything that you wish people would ask for that they never do?
I would have to say no. I mean, I'm not looking to, I mean, I'm a funny person. I feel best when I think I'm really helping somebody. Uh-huh. So in a lot of ways, I like my undergraduate students and stuff. Sometimes I like them better because they're just so much more excited, and there's so much they need to learn and want to learn, and they really take and run with everything. As opposed to a lot of the graduate students, they have a lot of the tools and techniques they need, and at some point they're trying to distance themselves from their professors at that point. Right. So it's not so much that I'm looking for any specific, it's not like, oh, you made me really happy by asking that question or something.
Right.
To me, it's more like the improvisation things. One of the things that keeps my job interesting is every year they come up and they bring me these new records, or they don't bring me records, but they bring me something. They bring me these new sound files and say, Dr. Pender, what are they doing? Right. And generally, I haven't heard the music because I'm older now, and so it keeps me active in the music that's happening today, and generally I can usually figure it out. So it's, it's like a challenge. It's like the crossword puzzle or something. Right. So I like these challenges they bring in. How can we do that? And then we figure out what they did, and then how we can do it with the tools that we have available to us.
Sure.
I mean, that challenge that's what I really like the most, I think.
Yeah, and then now finally one last thing about your background, because again, you have touched, you sort of like have entanglements into so many different parts of the musical world. I'm curious, like going back to sort of the most influential things, what were the things that influenced you most? Were they recordings? Were they seeing people live? Was it maybe a piece of gear? For me, when I go back, the two things that most changed the way I viewed the world was like a Blue Oyster Cult live album and the TIAC 3340 recorder, right? Mm-hmm. It's a pretty odd combination, but those two things both launched me on a path of exploration that was really critical to what I became. What are the things that were influential for you?
I guess a couple of things. One is when I moved to Cincinnati, Ohio when I was in my sophomore year of high school. And there is an excellent music conservatory there called the Cincinnati Conservatory of Music. And they have several halls there, and they do a ton of concerts, and all their concerts are free. And they had a very good, innovative music program there when I was in high school, and they would do all these John Cage concerts with the Black Earth Percussion Ensemble and a lot of synthesis stuff. So as a high school student, I was going down to the college because I could go to these concerts for free, right. And it was a cool thing that your parents didn't mind you doing, going to a concert at a college, right. That type of concert. So I was exposed to a lot of avant-garde classical music when I was in high school, and I was exposed to it through performances more so than through records. Sure. So I immediately, like I always do, I tried to figure out what they were doing and how I could do that, mostly with electric guitar and effects and whatnot, and to try to build up as big a performance as I could. The second thing was about that same time the Fripp and Eno stuff came out, and I started really seriously following that to the point that I eventually became a crafty guitarist and went down and studied with Robert Fripp and did that whole thing with him. Mm-hmm. And becoming a crafty guitarist, and that experience in a lot of ways is what made me decide to go back to music school. Because I was pretty successful as a guitar player. I was doing the background music for television. I had a commission from the Whitney that I did, a dance piece. But I just felt I couldn't break through where I was going to be able to make a living. And once I did the Fripp stuff, Fripp was really big on just downtown minimalism, Steve Reich, African drumming, and all that kind of stuff. And he just exposed me to this whole different world of music. And part of the thing was he would set up these challenges. You'd have lunch, and you'd say, all right, tonight we're going to play at this bar in Georgetown University. And so I kind of thrived in that circumstance. And so then I just kept pushing that. And that, strangely enough, led me to academia. I'm too much of a homebody, too, where I did spend time on the road and stuff, and I just don't have the personality for it.
Yeah, I think that's maybe one of the things that's actually pretty exciting about the current state of, of music, and especially, music of many genres, is that there are opportunities to do this without spending 300 days on the road.
Yeah.
So, our time is well up already. I appreciate you taking the opportunity to talk. One last thing, can you give us a little bit of a cue of what this cadenza course is going to be about, when it's going to start, and what people should expect?
I'm trying to put all my research into a book. It was going to come out on Routledge. It's not going to happen now. And what I've done is I'm taking all this material and I'm reconfiguring it for an online video course through Cadence. So it is basically going through kind of this history of production. So there'll be some historical lectures, but then kind of a deep dive into things like reverb and echo, compression, doubling, some of the standard things, but really looking at them in depth and having a lot of musical examples and that idea of setting up the canon so there's a body of work to listen to. Then I'll see where it goes from that. Part of the reason that I think it didn't work as a book is, they're trying to get it to write as an academic book, and I want to tell the story. Right. There's a very interesting story and people involved, and it's not always the people who got famous for doing these things. So I just think we have this history it hasn't really been written very well yet. So in a sense, I'm just trying to pull it all, rather than writing it myself, I'm just trying to pull all those pieces together. So there's a repository. We create this canon. We have an idea into these techniques. And, so I'll be doing, Logic projects. Some of them I'll just be recording myself. But again, a lot of techniques, and then how to use these things in a more creative way, hopefully. Give you some ideas to do things that you hadn't thought of doing before. But it is somebody who knows how to use Logic. They're mixing, and they really want to work on improving their mixes and improving their sound design, and to look at these effects in more detail and find out really what they can do.
And when is this going to start?
It will probably come out next summer.
Okay, and of course that answer requires me to ask the question, in collecting all of the stories that you've pulled together, what's one of the more amazing stories that you ran across that you feel that you could share now?
Well, I don't know if it's a story so much, but just, I think with echo, that we really have echo coming from two places. We have it coming from Bill Putnam Universal Audio with the early chess recordings, specifically on Little Walter's recordings. It starts with juke, and they're doing really interesting use of echo and distortion, and they're using that echo in a very formal manner where the echo is changing each verse. So the echo, and the way they're using the echo, is actually reinforcing the formal structure of the song. And it's just brilliant. It's subtle, and it changes every verse. And they do this with Little Walter for some reason. They make these records with him, and they're unbelievably interesting and refined. Then you have Sam Phillips down in Memphis with the slapback echo technique, which is a completely haphazard, catch-as-one-can technique. These guys are not wearing headphones, so they don't know where the echo is going. They're not playing in the early recordings, they're not playing in tempo with the echo, so the echo is not synced with them. So it's a very chaotic, swampy echo, and sometimes it sounds like Elvis is trying to actually swim and sing through that echo, as opposed to with the Bill Putnam thing, where it's just very refined and it's reinforcing the form of the song and it's making everything like crisper. And both of those ideas, the really refined and the really chaotic, are great. And they sound great. And it's just, I think, interesting that two completely different minds and set of circumstances and uses did this, but we kind of love it all. Sometimes we use the very refined, sometimes we go to the more kind of chaotic. So I think that's interesting. And then the fact that Sam Phillips was sending his records up to Bill Putnam to be mastered. So Putnam, I think, is the unsung hero of rock and roll who has not gotten all the credit he should, in my opinion.
There you go. Well, Terry, I want to thank you so much for taking the time. It's been fantastic catching up on some of this stuff, getting to know a little bit more about your background. I look forward to being able to take your course, but I also look forward to getting a chance to talk to you again soon.
Yeah, I hope so.
All right, man. Have a great afternoon then.
Okay, thank you very much.
many thanks to Terry for hanging out and talking about his background and some of the things that he's experienced over the years. And just keep an eye on this cadenza thing. It looks like it's going to be pretty great. Also keep an eye on in case that book ever does come out, because Terry's got an incredible background of knowledge on this stuff. So really cool stuff. Thank you so much for listening, and we will catch you again next week. Bye.